The forest didn't whisper, it screamed. 1,000 stakes clawed toward the sky like crooked fingers, each crowned with a rotting human head, eyes long devoured by crows, tongues stiff in the silence of death. The stench was unbearable, a grotesque perfume of flesh and iron and earth seeping into every breath, into every thought. The Danube shimmered nearby, reflecting not sunlight but torment. Soldiers dared not look too long. Even the wind refused to stay. This was not a battlefield. This was a message. And at the center of it all stood a man in black, silent, motionless, his face carved in ice. His name was Vlad, son of the dragon, prince of Wallachia. But the world would come to call him something else, Țepeș the Impaler. Power can decay in many forms, but few downfalls are as grotesque, as symbolic as the collapse of Vlad III. For a man who once held empires in suspense, who turned his enemies into ash with fear alone, his final defeat did not come from a mighty conqueror, nor a God-ordained king. It came from shadows, the same shadows he once used as his cloak. It came from betrayal rot and the slow poison of isolation. As we step into the blood-soaked mountains of Wallachia, in the harsh winter of 1476, prepare for a story where love and vengeance are indistinguishable, where loyalty dies quicker than flesh, and where terror itself becomes a crown. This is not merely a story about violence or madness, though there is plenty of both. It is a tale of the sickness that power spreads when fed through grief, through humiliation, through generations of broken promises. It is a reminder that in a world built on conquest, only monsters survive. Not even a prince born of dragons could escape the oldest truth of all. The man who wields fear as a weapon will, in time, be devoured by it. Before the stakes, before the legend, there was a boy. Thin, silent eyes, too dark for his age. He rode east under armed guard, away from the Carpathians, away from his mother's arms, toward the golden towers of Edirne, the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire. It was not a visit. It was a surrender. In 1442, Vlad Dracul, father to Vlad III, bent the knee to Sultan Murad II. To buy peace and keep his fragile throne in Wallachia, he offered his 2 sons as hostages. Radu, the younger, soft and beautiful, took to the Ottoman palace like a swan to water. But Vlad was different. He stared at his captors with a quiet hatred that festered into something lethal. In Edirne, he learned Turkish tactics, cruelty. He saw men flayed alive. He watched the executions of traitors, slow, meticulous, public. He learned what power truly meant, not gold nor armies, but fear. It roots deeper. It lingers longer. He watched the sultans plant it like a black seed in every man's chest. When his father was murdered by Wallachian boyars nobles who feigned loyalty with poisoned smiles, and his brother Mircea was buried alive with his eyes gouged out, the lesson became gospel. There would be no mercy. Not for traitors, not for the weak, never again. He returned to Wallachia, not as a son, but as a ghost, reassembled into steel and vengeance. The throne was empty. The land torn by infighting, invaded from every direction, a puppet for foreign empires. Vlad did not beg for support. He took it. In the autumn of 1456, with Hungarian backing and Ottoman tactics, Vlad III seized the crown by fire and blood. The nobles who had murdered his family were summoned to a feast. They came dressed in velvet, unaware of the trap. That night they were arrested, beaten, and marched 50 miles to a mountain fortress. Those who survived were forced to build it stone by stone until they collapsed under their own guilt and labour. Their bodies were never recovered. Only the castle remained. Vlad began to reshape Wallachia in his image. A land of strict order. No theft, no corruption, no rebellion. The penalty was always the same, the stake. Victims impaled through the abdomen or chest, the sharpened wood splitting them slowly until their screams died with their breath. It wasn't punishment, it was theatre, a message, a warning carved in flesh. And yet, paradoxically, it worked. Trade flourished. Crime vanished. Travellers claimed they could leave a sack of gold in the road and return to find it untouched. Merchants whispered of a prince who ruled with fire but brought peace. Foreign kings watched with unease. The Ottomans called him ally. For now. But peace born of horror never lasts, and Vlad knew it. He heard the whispers of Ottoman spies, of boyar plots of betrayal. Radu, his own brother, now beloved at the Ottoman court, was being groomed as a rival. Murad had died. His successor, Mehmed the Conqueror, sought new frontiers to subdue, and Wallachia was a dagger pointed at the empire's throat. Vlad stood between giants, the Hungarian crown to the west, the Ottoman crescent to the east, and smiled like a man who knew neither would save him. He would save himself. But the spark had already caught. The blood had already boiled. The thrones of kings creaked under ambition, and in the silent nights of Targoviste, the impalements began anew. The fires that once warmed Vlad's throne began to flicker. The iron grip that had silenced his enemies now drew whispers in the shadows. For years, fear had built his kingdom, every stake planted like a pillar of control, every scream a lullaby for order. But fear is a fickle foundation. The moment it begins to crack, everything trembles. At first, the changes were subtle. An emissary from Transylvania vanished on his journey home. A boyar's cousin, once seen feasting at Vlad's table, was found headless in the river. The neighbouring Saxon merchants, once profitable allies, suddenly closed their gates and armed their walls. The Holy Roman Empire took notice. Letters passed between kings, describing Vlad not as prince or ruler, but as lunatic demon butcher. The propaganda began to spread like smoke in dry timber. It wasn't difficult. The rumours had foundation. Vlad's punishments grew more erratic. Impalement was no longer reserved for traitors. It met thieves, beggars, lovers of the wrong class. He claimed he was purifying the soul of his land. The people, once too grateful to speak, now too terrified to whisper, began to fear what sunrise might bring. But Vlad saw these shifts not as signs of cruelty, but necessity. He was alone, surrounded by snakes. The Ottomans, enraged by his refusal to pay tribute and his humiliation of their envoys, sharpened their swords. Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror of Constantinople, could no longer ignore the insult. At the same time, Vlad's alliance with Hungary frayed. King Matthias Corvinus, under pressure from foreign courts and his own fragile nobility, began to consider Vlad less an ally and more a liability. Vlad responded as he always had, not with compromise but with spectacle. He raided Ottoman territories with ruthless precision, burning villages, poisoning wells, and leaving impaled soldiers along the Danube banks, hundreds at a time, their bodies visible from the enemy ships. It was not war, it was theatre, a wall of agony screaming, "Come no further." When the Sultan marched with over 90,000 men to crush Wallachia, he found a country stripped bare. Villages smouldered, crops were burned. Even wells had been stuffed with corpses to poison the water. But the most harrowing sight awaited him near Targoviste. A forest of 20,000 impaled bodies, soldiers, civilians, even women and children. The stench of decay so thick it made camels refuse to cross. The Sultan, it is said, paused in silence before the horror. He turned to his generals and muttered, "It is not possible to deprive a man of a country who is willing to burn it to ash himself." But awe was not victory. Mehmed left scorched and shaken, but not defeated. Vlad had survived the fire, but his land had not. His people, bled dry and sick with grief, began to see not a protector but a curse. They begged for peace, for someone else. Radu, Vlad's brother, now stood at the edge of the Danube with an Ottoman-backed army. He promised clemency, trade, and mercy. The boyars, ever eager to save their own skin, began to turn. Villagers surrendered before battle. Soldiers defected mid-fight. Vlad, once the embodiment of vengeance, found himself without support, his name trembling in the mouths of the very people he swore to defend. Targovishte was abandoned. The capital, stripped and quiet, fell without resistance. Vlad fled north, seeking refuge in Hungary, the last desperate hope clutched in his bloodied hands. But he had burned too many bridges. The Hungarian king did not offer sanctuary. He offered shackles. And in the cold stone of a Hungarian prison, the man who had once made emperors tremble sat in silence, watching the shadows lengthen. There is a kind of silence that only exists in betrayal, not absence of sound, but the muffled howl of a soul cracking inward. Vlad sat shackled in a cell beneath Buda Castle, his hands raw, his clothes ragged, but his eyes untouched by time. For 12 years he rotted not just in stone and straw, but in the forgetfulness of history. He who had turned Wallachia into a wall of flame against the east was now paraded as a prisoner, a relic of shame for Hungary's court. King Matthias Corvinus did not execute him. That would have been clean. Instead, he used Vlad as a pawn, showcasing him to foreign envoys as proof of Christian temperance, while secretly sending forgeries of Vlad's supposed dealings with the Ottomans to justify his imprisonment. A convenient lie, one that allowed Matthias to appease his allies while removing the most dangerous man in Eastern Europe from the board. For Vlad, this was the final insult. He had been a hostage once before as a child in the Ottoman court. Then he had waited, watched, and emerged sharpened. Now, again he waited. And what he saw this time was more terrifying than chains time had moved on without him. His brother Radu ruled Wallachia, with Ottoman backing, yes, but with peace. The land was stable, the nobles pacified. The people, they no longer cried for Vlad's return. Radu had given them gentle rule, fewer corpses, quieter days. And to a people bled by decades of fire, silence was enough. But Vlad did not forget, nor forgive. When Radu died unexpectedly in 1475, and the Ottoman grip on Wallachia wavered, a crack opened. It was small, fleeting, but for a man like Vlad, it was enough. Old enemies now needed him. The Hungarian court, sensing opportunity, reluctantly released him. Money changed hands. Forgiveness was staged. Vlad, older, now scarred and bitter, emerged from his cage with a single goal: to reclaim what was taken. He had no army, no allies, no guarantee of survival. But he had one final weapon: the terror of his name. When he entered Wallachia once more in the dead of winter, it was not as a prince, but as a phantom. Snow melted where he walked. Old soldiers kissed his feet. Enemies flinched at rumors of his approach. For a moment, just a flicker, the old fire returned. But this was not the Wallachia he had ruled. The boyars he once impaled now sat fat and fortified. The people had learned to live without him, and the Ottomans had not forgotten the forest of stakes. Still, Vlad pushed forward. With Hungarian support and the last remnants of loyal men, he seized the throne one final time in November 1476. But the moment he placed the crown upon his brow, it no longer felt like gold, it felt like iron, heavy and hollow. There were no cheers, no festivals, just the sound of wind through bare trees and the soft murmur of doubt. In a desperate attempt to cement his rule, Vlad turned to old methods. Executions returned. Suspected traitors vanished. But this time, the fear did not yield loyalty. It yielded resistance. No one wished to burn again. And then came the letter. Ottoman scouts had crossed the border. Another army, smaller surgical, was on the move. Vlad knew they weren't coming to conquer Wallachia. They were coming to erase him. He stood alone, encircled not by spears, but by silence. No kings came to his aid. No peasants rose in rebellion. His past glories were now ashes blown into the wind, settling in graves he had long forgotten. That winter, in a remote pass in the Carpathians, he marched with a small band of loyalists, unaware that among them rode his death. They wore his crest, they spoke his oaths, and when night fell, they struck. The snow fell in silence, thick, smothering, as if the heavens themselves wished to bury what was about to happen. In the narrow ravine near the village of Snagov, the wind carried no howls of battle, no clash of steel. Just the soft crunch of hooves and boots as Vlad's small column moved through the pines, unaware that Betrayal galloped beside them. They had ridden all day through sleet and fog, eyes raw from the cold blades dulled from the frost. Vlad, cloaked in black, rode at the front head, bowed as if sensing something deeper than the chill. He had known fear not of death, but of obscurity, of fading into rumour, into myth, without reclaiming the name they had tried to stain. He had seen himself as a wall, not a man, a boundary against invasion, a figure carved into stone through brutality, because kindness, he learned long ago, was a prelude to betrayal. But even walls crack. That night, they camped near a frozen brook. The moon was weak-veiled in clouds. Flames flickered from a small fire, barely enough to hold the cold at bay. Vlad sat alone, sharpening a dagger with shaking hands. He was older now, not frail, but weathered the scars on his palms like forgotten verses. Around him, the men whispered in tones they thought he could not hear, about the Ottomans, about gold, about mercy for a deed already planned. He had always known he would not die old. He had accepted that. But this, not in battle, not in glory, not even in defiance, just cold steel from behind from hands that once pledged loyalty. In the hours before dawn, as the others slept or pretended to, Vlad stood and walked from the camp into the trees. The snow fell harder now, veiling the world in white silence. He looked toward the mountains, their peaks lost in the clouds, and he whispered something. Not a prayer, he had long given up on such illusions. It was a name perhaps, or a curse, or a plea that no longer mattered. And then he waited. But death did not come that night. It came the next morning, without ceremony, without trumpet. As they prepared to ride again, one man hesitated behind him. Another dismounted slowly. A third placed his hand near his sword. Vlad turned, meeting their eyes, and in that instant the fire returned. The look he gave was not fear nor rage. It was recognition. He had seen this play before. He fought. Of course he did. The ground was slick with blood and snow, his blade carving arcs of crimson into the white world. But it was never a battle. It was an execution. By midday, it was over. They left his body in the snow, disfigured, half-buried mouth frozen open, his armor stripped, his ring stolen. The prince who had impaled armies now lay twisted in the cold, anonymous and discarded. A few days later, his severed head would arrive at the court of Sultan Mehmed II, preserved in honey, mounted on a pike. The man who once mocked empires now stared sightless at the feet of one. And somewhere in the forests of Wallachia, the stakes he had once planted still stood, swaying in the wind, groaning under the weight of bones long picked clean. A ghastly forest without roots grown from vengeance decayed in silence. No funeral, no tomb, just whispers, just snow. That was his abyss. The snow did not melt where his blood fell. In the hours before his death, Vlad had known. There was no formal sentence, no court or council, no drawn-out verdict with scribes and scrolls. Just the slow encircling of silence men who no longer met his eyes. Orders relayed with caution, the subtle way fingers lingered too long near hilts. He had seen this before many times on the faces of traitors awaiting execution. Now he saw it reflected in his own company. And yet he did not flee. He had come too far, escaped too much. What was left to run toward the throne he once sat on now belonged to ghosts and silence. The people he had ruled no longer called his name in prayer, only in cautionary tales to children. He had fought to reclaim Wallachia not for comfort, but because without it he was nothing. Without the terror he inspired, what was left, a man, a relic. That final morning he woke before the others. The frost had settled like dust upon his black cloak. He moved quietly through the camp, his breath rising in soft clouds, his boots crunching softly on the snow-packed ground. For a long while, he stood near the edge of the trees, looking westward toward Hungary, toward the lands that had once imprisoned him, then briefly crowned him again. No horses stirred, no voices rose, just wind low and mournful, weaving through branches like the whisper of lost brothers. Radu, Mircea, all gone. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden carving, crude, faded, half-rotted. A dragon, his father's sigil. The Order of the Dragon had once bound them together, defenders of Christendom, symbols of resistance. But that order, like everything else, had rotted from within. He gripped it tightly for a moment, then let it fall into the snow. Later that morning, when the men mounted their horses and began their journey through the pass, Vlad's face was impassive but alert. His eyes scanned every gesture, every flinch, and when the first rider slowed behind him, he knew. Even as the blade rose behind his back, he did not beg, did not plead. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough to lock eyes with the man. And for a heartbeat, time froze. No anger, no fear, just something colder, disappointment. Then, steel bit into flesh. They said he did not fall at first, that he staggered, turned, struck back, a whirlwind of motion, of fury, distilled into muscle memory, that it took 4 men to finish him. That even impaled on their blades, he did not scream. And when it was over, they stood around his broken body, breathing hard. The snow drank the red quietly. There was no eulogy, no rites. His body was mutilated, the head severed with great care, cleaned, wrapped in cloth, soaked in brine. It would travel hundreds of miles across frozen fields and war-torn roads to Constantinople. A trophy. Proof to the Sultan that the monster of Wallachia had finally been slain. They say Mehmed looked upon it without speaking, that he examined the features carefully, the angular jaw, the arched brow, the mouth still twisted in defiance, and then ordered it mounted on a spike above the gates of his city. So the people would know, so the world would see. But the truth was not in that lifeless face, nor in the snow where his body vanished. The truth was in the silence he left behind. A silence louder than war. For when fear dies, it does not go quietly. It lingers, like frostbite, like rot. His head watched over Constantinople like a curse nailed to the sky. Mounted high upon a spike above the gates of the Ottoman capital, Vlad's severed face slowly decayed under sun and storm, his skin curling from bone, his mouth locked in that final frozen snarl. Citizens passed beneath him, some recoiling, others spitting a few whispering prayers. Children were told, "That was the devil of Wallachia. Look what became of him." But few knew what the body had suffered before it parted from the neck. There was no battlefield, no court, His death was private, intimate, and cruel, like the deaths he had once dealt to others. His assassins had known him. Some had broken bread with him. Their betrayal was surgical, quick to the world, but slow to the soul. They buried his body hastily in an unmarked grove, or so the stories say, though no grave has ever been found. Some claim it was tossed in a ravine. Others that it was fed to wild dogs, the final insult to a man who believed legacy would preserve him. And yet, the execution did not end with his death. Vlad's true execution, the kind that lingers, was conducted by memory. Word of his fall spread fast. Kings rejoiced. Nobles breathed easier. The Ottomans celebrated but cautiously, for even in death, Vlad's terror shadowed the land he once ruled. The roads to Targovishte grew quiet again, not from fear of him returning, but from the eerie stillness he had left behind. The impaled bodies, now half rotted and bent from time, still stood in their cursed fields. The wood had darkened, the flesh gone waxen. Wolves nested beneath them. Ravens no longer bothered the meat had turned to leather. Travellers would dismount and pass on foot whispering prayers as they walked among the corpses. It was said that if one listened closely, the wind still carried faint cries, or that sometimes a stake would fall without touch, as if finally it had exhaled. No one dared clear the field, not for months, not until the weather erased it. In that way, Vlad's execution was incomplete. It was physical, yes, the blade, the separation of head and body, the public shaming. But it did not erase him. Not truly. How could it? He had etched himself into the very geography of fear. Every village that survived his wrath bore his scars like invisible tattoos. Every noble who had once betrayed him now lived in dread of the next warlord who might come wielding his name like a weapon. And in time, that's exactly what happened. But before Dracula, before the books and the myths, before the fangs and the bats and the cloaks, there was this: a mutilated corpse in the Carpathians, a head on a spike, a silence so loud it made empires tremble. His death was not a purge, it was a catalyst. From the ashes of his reign, the West constructed a legend, but the East remembered a warning. The Ottomans, despite their dominance, never fully pacified Wallachia. It remained a thorn, a boundary marked in trauma. The execution had ended the man, but it had birthed the symbol, not of cruelty alone, but of what cruelty can build, and what it inevitably destroys. The man who ruled through fear died by the very thing he mastered: unseen enemies, hidden blades, and silence, where once his voice echoed like thunder. And so the final stake was never driven into flesh. It was driven into the idea of invincibility, into the delusion that terror alone can keep a kingdom alive. That is what killed Vlad. Not the sword, but history itself. Centuries have passed, and still the shadow stretches. His body was never found. His grave, if it exists, is lost beneath layers of silence, earth, and dread. Some say he rests beneath the ruins of a monastery near Snagov Lake. Others insist his remains lie beneath the roots of an ancient oak, gnarled and half dead, somewhere deep in the Carpathians. Wherever it is, no tombstone marks it, no prayers are said. But his name, it survived. To the Romanians, Vlad Țepeș remains a paradox, protector and predator. A national symbol born of pain. They remember the fire, yes, but also the shield it formed. In a time when Europe bled and bent beneath the Ottoman crescent, Vlad did not bend. He raised stakes. He made terror his sword and fear his fortress. And for a moment bought with screams and bones, it worked. He's remembered in whispered reverence by some, the man who cleansed Wallachia of corruption, who gave no quarter to the invader who ruled with justice, even if his justice bled. Towns still bear his mark. Coins were minted in his image. His fortress at Poenari, built by the hands of murdered nobles, still clings to its cliff like a scar refusing to fade. Yet in the West, he became something else entirely: Dracula. The bloodthirsty count, cursed with eternal life, born not of history but of imagination, yet rooted in the man who once drank victory from the edge of a stake. Bram Stoker borrowed the name but kept little else, and yet the damage, or perhaps the magic, was done. Vlad's legacy was no longer in scrolls or records. It was in myth, and myth, unlike men, does not die. But peel back the legend, and something colder remains a truth about the nature of power. About how it corrupts not just the one who holds it, but the world that fears it. Vlad ruled in an age where mercy was weakness, where treaties were ash, and where survival required more than strength, it required spectacle. He turned punishment into performance, justice into intimidation, and in doing so, he bought himself a throne made of corpses. And it held until it didn't. Because fear, though powerful, is ravenous. It demands more. And when there's nothing left to feed it, it turns on its master. That is the lesson history leaves at the foot of Vlad's empty grave. That terror may win the day, but it cannot outlive the night. In his final silence, Vlad Țepeș became more than man, more than myth. He became a mirror held up to rulers, tyrants, even to nations, asking one question over and over again: what will you sacrifice to be remembered? For Vlad, the answer was everything. His throne, his people, his soul, all offered to the stake. And long after the forests have grown back, after the screams have faded, and the bones have turned to dust, the echo remains. A cold wind through old trees, a castle crumbling on the mountain, and a name never quite forgotten.